The Nevada dust settled like fine powder over everything it touched, coating the weathered fence posts and sun-bleached barn of the Double R Ranch in a perpetual layer of grit. Marcus Reed stood in the doorway of his equipment shed, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that had seen better days. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, creating shimmering waves of heat that danced across the parched landscape. His cattle operation had been struggling for 3 years running, ever since the drought began in earnest, and feed prices skyrocketed beyond reason. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. At 42, Marcus had the weathered look of a man who'd spent his entire adult life working under an unforgiving sky. His father's ranch, his grandfather's before that, stretched across 1,500 acres of high desert country where sagebrush and juniper trees dotted the rolling hills like ancient sentinels. The land held beauty for those who understood it, but it demanded respect and gave little in return without a fight. Today had been particularly brutal. 2 more of his breeding cows had shown signs of heat stress, and the well pump in the north pasture had finally given up its ghost. Marcus calculated the repair costs in his head, adding them to the growing list of expenses that kept him awake at night. The bank payment was due in 6 weeks, and unless something changed dramatically, he'd be having a very uncomfortable conversation with his loan officer. He heard the engine before he saw the vehicle, an old pickup truck coughing and sputtering its way up the dirt road that served as his driveway. Visitors were uncommon out here, 25 miles from the nearest town of Cedar Falls. The mailman came twice a week, and old Pete from the neighboring spread occasionally stopped by to complain about shared fence lines or borrowed tools. But this engine sounded different. Struggling in a way that suggested mechanical problems beyond simple age, Marcus stepped out of the shed, shielding his eyes against the late afternoon glare as the pickup lurched to a stop near his front porch. The vehicle looked like it had seen better decades, with rust eating through the wheel wells and a windshield spiderwebbed with cracks. Steam rose from under the hood in ominous white clouds, and the engine gave a final, dying wheeze before falling silent. The driver's door opened with a protesting screech of metal on metal, and a woman emerged, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who'd been driving for far too long. She appeared to be in her late 20s or early 30s, with auburn hair pulled back in a ponytail that had mostly given up its fight against the heat and humidity. Her clothes were rumpled and travel-stained, a simple cotton dress that might have been blue once but had faded to an indeterminate gray-green color. But it wasn't the woman that caught Marcus's attention first. It was the sound coming from inside the truck, a thin, persistent wailing that spoke of infant distress and exhaustion. The woman hurried around to the passenger side, her movements urgent but gentle as she lifted out a baby carrier. Inside, a tiny child squirmed and cried with the red-faced determination that only babies could muster. As if that weren't strange enough, the woman then reached back into the truck and carefully extracted a wire pet carrier. Through the mesh sides, Marcus could see a rust-colored hen, its feathers ruffled and its eyes darting nervously as it took in the unfamiliar surroundings. The chicken let out a low, questioning cluck, as if asking what fresh hell it had been transported to. The woman stood for a moment beside her broken-down truck, baby carrier in one hand, chicken cage in the other, looking like someone who'd reached the absolute end of her rope and found it frayed beyond repair. Her shoulders sagged with exhaustion, and even from a distance, Marcus could see the way her hands trembled slightly from stress or fatigue, or both. Marcus found himself walking toward her before he'd consciously decided to move. There was something about the scene that tugged at him, maybe the way she held herself with stubborn dignity despite clearly being in dire straits. Or maybe it was just that no one should be stranded in the middle of nowhere with a crying baby and a chicken. Engine trouble? He called out as he approached, though the answer was obvious from the steam still rising from under the hood. The woman looked up at him with eyes that were green as spring grass and twice as weary. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, her voice hoarse from what sounded like hours of driving and probably crying. "My truck just died, and I don't know anyone around here. Is there maybe a mechanic in town, or could I use your phone to call for help?" Marcus studied her face, noting the way she held herself with careful control despite the chaos of her situation. The baby's crying had intensified, if that was possible, and the hen in its carrier was making increasingly agitated sounds. "I'm Marcus Reed," he said, extending a hand that was clean despite his earlier work. "This is my place. Phone's inside if you need it, but I should warn you, getting a tow truck out here is going to cost you plenty, and finding parts for a truck that old might take some doing." "I'm Amy," she replied, shifting the baby carrier to shake his hand briefly. Her grip was firm despite the tremor in her fingers. "Amy Sullivan. This is my daughter Rose, and that's Henrietta." She nodded toward the chicken carrier with what might have been the ghost of a smile. "We've been driving for 2 days straight, trying to get to California where my sister lives. I guess we didn't make it." Marcus looked at the steam still rising from the truck's engine and made a quick assessment. The radiator was likely cracked, possibly the head gasket too, given the way the engine had sounded in its final moments. Even if parts were available, the repair cost would probably exceed the vehicle's value by a considerable margin. "Mind if I take a look?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew what he'd find. Amy nodded gratefully, still bouncing the baby carrier, in an attempt to soothe little Rose's crying. Marcus popped the hood and immediately saw the problem. Coolant had sprayed everywhere, coating the engine block in a sticky green mess. The radiator had a crack running along its bottom edge that looked like it had been growing for some time, and the water pump showed signs of serious wear. This truck wasn't going anywhere under its own power anytime soon. "How bad is it?" Amy asked, though her tone suggested she already expected the worst. Marcus straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Bad enough that you're looking at repairs that'll cost more than the truck's worth, assuming we could even find the parts. This old girl's seen her last mile, I'm afraid." Amy's face went pale, and for a moment Marcus thought she might collapse. The baby's crying reached a new crescendo, and even the hen seemed to sense the despair in the air, clucking with what sounded like sympathy. Amy closed her eyes and took a deep breath, clearly fighting back tears. "I see," she said finally, her voice carefully controlled. "Well, thank you for looking. I guess I'll call my sister and see if she can wire money for a bus ticket or something." Marcus found himself studying this woman more closely. There was something about her situation that didn't quite add up. 2 days of driving, heading to California with nothing but a baby, a chicken, and a truck that looked like it had been held together with prayers and determination. People didn't usually travel that light unless they were running from something, and the careful way she avoided details about her situation suggested there was more to her story than she was willing to share. "Bus station's in Cedar Falls," he said, "but the next one heading west doesn't come through until Thursday, and that's 3 days from now. Town's got a motel, but it's not much, and with the baby—" He trailed off, noting the way Amy's jaw tightened at the mention of extended delay and additional expenses. Rose chose that moment to escalate her crying to a level that seemed physically impossible for such a small person. Amy immediately began the complex dance that all mothers knew, shifting the carrier, making soothing sounds, checking for obvious problems. But the baby was clearly past the point where simple comfort would suffice. "She's hungry," Amy said, more to herself than to Marcus, "and probably needs a change. I've got formula in the truck, but she's been fussy all day. I think the heat and the strange surroundings are getting to her." Marcus looked from the crying baby to the obviously exhausted mother to the chicken that was now making its own contributions to the general cacophony of distress. A crazy idea was forming in his mind, the kind of impulse that his practical nature usually suppressed before it could take root. But something about this situation, about this woman's quiet dignity in the face of disaster, made him ignore his usual caution. "Look," he said, raising his voice slightly to be heard over Rose's protests. "I've got a spare room in the house, and it's cool inside. Why don't you come in, get the baby settled, maybe have something to eat and drink? We can figure out your next move once everyone's calmed down a bit." Amy looked at him with surprise and what might have been suspicion. "That's very kind, but I couldn't impose. We're strangers, and you've already done more than enough just by looking at the truck." "Ma'am, it's nearly 100 degrees out here, and that baby's not going to settle down in this heat." "I'm not suggesting anything permanent, just a place to cool off and regroup." Marcus gestured toward his house, a modest ranch-style building with a deep porch that promised shade and relief from the punishing sun. "Besides, I've got air conditioning and cold water, both of which you look like you could use." Amy hesitated, clearly torn between desperation and the ingrained caution that had probably served her well in whatever circumstances had brought her to this point. Rose's crying intensified again, and the decision seemed to make itself. "Just for a little while," she said, "until I can figure out what to do next." Marcus nodded and moved to help her gather her things. The chicken carrier was heavier than he'd expected, and Henrietta fixed him with a beady-eyed stare that seemed to question his intentions. "Interesting traveling companion," he commented as they walked toward the house. Amy's cheeks colored slightly. "I know it seems strange, but Henrietta was my grandmother's chicken. When Grandma died 6 months ago, I couldn't bear to leave her behind. She's all I have left of family, besides Rose." There was pain in those words, old grief mixed with recent loss, and Marcus filed the information away without comment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Everyone had their stories, their reasons for holding on to things that might seem foolish to outsiders. He'd learned long ago not to judge what people chose to carry with them through life's upheavals. The house was indeed cooler, though not by much. Marcus's air conditioning unit was older than dirt, and wheezed almost as badly as Amy's truck had, but it managed to keep the interior temperature bearable. He led her to the spare bedroom, a simple space with a single bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the eastern pasture where his remaining cattle clustered in whatever shade they could find. "Bathroom's right across the hall," he said, setting down the chicken carrier carefully. "Kitchen's at the end of the hallway if you need anything. I'll be outside for a while, checking on the stock, so make yourself at home." Amy looked around the room with something approaching relief. "Thank you," she said simply. "Really, I don't know what we would have done if you hadn't been here." Marcus nodded, and left her to tend to Rose, whose crying had finally begun to subside in the cooler air. He could hear Amy's voice through the closed door, soft and soothing as she talked to her daughter, the kind of gentle murmur that spoke of infinite patience despite exhaustion. Outside, Marcus found himself thinking about his unexpected guests as he went through the motions of his evening chores. The cattle were handling the heat reasonably well, though he made a mental note to check the water tanks again before turning in for the night. The chickens in his own coop were panting in the shade, wings spread to catch any hint of breeze. That reminded him of Amy's hen, and he wondered what the story was there. People didn't usually travel cross-country with chickens unless there were compelling reasons. The fact that it had belonged to her grandmother suggested sentimental value, but there was something else about the way Amy had mentioned it, a careful tone that implied the bird might be more than just a keepsake. By the time Marcus finished his rounds and headed back to the house, the sun was painting the western sky in shades of orange and red. That would have been beautiful if they hadn't also promised another scorching day to follow. The temperature was finally beginning to drop, though it would be hours before the air became truly comfortable. He found Amy in the kitchen, standing at the sink with Rose propped against one shoulder. The baby had finally settled into the exhausted sleep that follows a good cry, and Amy was carefully washing a bottle with one hand while supporting her daughter with the other. "She's beautiful," Marcus said softly, not wanting to wake the sleeping child. Amy smiled, the first genuine expression of happiness he'd seen from her. "She's my world," she said simply. "Everything I do is for her." Marcus nodded, understanding that kind of devotion even though he'd never experienced it himself. "How old is she?" 4 months, Amy replied, shifting Rose slightly to get a better grip on the bottle she was washing. "Born right at the beginning of spring, when everything was new and hopeful." There was wistfulness in her voice, as if those hopeful days belonged to someone else's life. "And you're heading to California to be near family?" Amy's hand stilled for a moment, and Marcus caught a flash of something that might have been fear before she resumed her washing. "My sister lives in Sacramento. She's got a good job there, says she can help me get on my feet, maybe find work." It was a reasonable explanation, but something about the way she said it suggested there were details being left out. Marcus didn't press, though. Everyone was entitled to their privacy, especially someone who looked like they'd been through enough already. "What about Henrietta?" he asked instead, nodding toward the spare room where they'd left the chicken carrier. Amy's smile returned, though it was tinged with sadness. "She was my grandmother's pride and joy. Grandma raised chickens her whole life, said they were better company than most people. Henrietta's special, or at least she was. She used to lay the most beautiful eggs, deep brown, with the richest yolks you ever saw." "Used to?" Amy sighed, finally finishing with the bottle and setting it aside to dry. "She hasn't laid an egg in over 2 months. I've tried everything I can think of. Different foods, different surroundings, even took her to a veterinarian in the last town we passed through. He said there's nothing physically wrong with her, but she just won't lay. Marcus found himself genuinely intrigued. Chickens could be temperamental creatures, affected by stress, changes in environment, or sometimes just mysterious chicken logic that defied human understanding. But 2 months was a long time for a healthy hen to go without laying, especially one that had been productive before. Mind if I take a look at her? Amy looked surprised. You know about chickens? I keep a small flock for eggs. Nothing fancy, just a few birds that earn their keep. But I've learned a thing or two about their moods and habits over the years. They walked back to the spare room together, Rose still sleeping peacefully in Amy's arms. Henrietta had settled into a corner of her carrier, head tucked under one wing in the universal chicken position for dealing with stress. She was a handsome bird, Marcus noted, with rust-colored feathers that gleamed with health despite her recent travels. She's a Rhode Island Red, Amy said, noting his interest. Grandma always said they were the best layers, steady and reliable. Marcus crouched down to get a better look at the hen. Henrietta opened one suspicious eye to regard him, then apparently decided he wasn't an immediate threat, and tucked her head back under her wing. She looks healthy enough, he agreed. Good color, bright eyes, no signs of mites or disease. Sometimes they just need the right environment to get back into their rhythm. I keep hoping she'll start again once we're settled somewhere permanent. She's all I have left of Grandma, and it would mean so much if she could be productive again, especially with Rose to think about. Fresh eggs would be such a blessing. There was something in Amy's voice, a note of desperate hope mixed with practical need, that made Marcus think about his own situation. His chicken coop could certainly accommodate one more bird, and he had the experience to potentially figure out what was keeping Henrietta from laying. But more than that, there was something about Amy herself that made him want to help, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Maybe it was the way she held her daughter with such fierce protectiveness, or the quiet dignity she maintained despite being obviously at the end of her resources. Maybe it was simply that his ranch felt less empty with voices in it, even if one of those voices belonged to a crying baby and another to a neurotic chicken. The idea that had been forming in his mind earlier began to solidify into something approaching a plan. It was crazy, impractical, and probably doomed to failure, but Marcus had always been more of a doer than a thinker when it came to decisions that mattered. Amy, he said, straightening up and turning to face her, I've got a proposition for you. She looked at him warily, that careful expression returning to her eyes. What kind of proposition? I need help around here, Marcus said, the words coming out in a rush before he could reconsider them. The drought's been hard on the operation, and I've had to let my hired hands go. There's work that needs doing, more than one person can handle alone. Cooking, cleaning, bookkeeping, general ranch maintenance, things that would be easier with an extra pair of hands. Amy's expression didn't change, but Marcus could see her processing the information, looking for the catch that experience had taught her was always there. Here's the deal, he continued. You can stay here, you and Rose. There's plenty of room, and it would be good to have the company. In exchange, you help me get this place back on its feet. But there's a condition. What condition? Marcus gestured toward Henrietta's carrier. You have to get that chicken laying again. And Rose has to stop crying long enough for a man to get some sleep at night. Amy blinked, clearly not having expected those particular terms. That's your condition? Get my chicken to lay eggs and my baby to sleep through the night? That's right. Solve both problems, and you've got a place here as long as you need it. Fail, and you're welcome to stay until you figure out your next move. But the arrangement ends there. Amy stared at him for a long moment, and Marcus could practically see the wheels turning in her head. It was an odd proposition, he had to admit, but something about it felt right in a way he couldn't explain. Why? She asked finally. Why would you offer something like that to a complete stranger? Marcus looked around the spare room, at the woman holding her sleeping daughter, at the chicken that had traveled hundreds of miles in a pet carrier, at the whole improbable situation that had landed on his doorstep like something out of a fever dream. Because this place has been too quiet for too long, he said finally. Because everyone deserves a chance to start over when life knocks them down. And because I've got a feeling that if anyone can figure out what's bothering that chicken, it's the woman who cared enough to bring her along on a cross-country journey. Amy looked down at Rose, then over at Henrietta's carrier, then back at Marcus. What if I can't do it? What if Henrietta never lays again, or Rose keeps having trouble sleeping? Then we'll figure something else out. But I've got a hunch about you, Amy Sullivan. You've got the look of someone who doesn't give up easy, and that's exactly what this place needs right now. Outside, the Nevada evening was settling into the kind of twilight that made the high desert country look almost magical, all purple shadows and golden light. Inside the spare room, a woman stood holding her sleeping daughter, contemplating an offer that was either the answer to her prayers or the beginning of a whole new set of complications. "How long do I have?" she asked. "To solve the problems, I mean." Marcus hadn't thought that far ahead, but looking at her now, at the hope and fear warring in her green eyes, he made another impulsive decision. Let's say a month. That should be enough time to figure out what's troubling Henrietta and get Rose settled into a routine. Amy was quiet for several minutes, the only sound in the room, the soft breathing of her sleeping daughter and the occasional rustle from Henrietta's carrier. Finally, she looked up at Marcus with something approaching determination. "All right," she said. "I accept your proposition. 1 month to get Henrietta laying and Rose sleeping through the night, in exchange for room and board and help around the ranch." Marcus felt a surge of something that might have been relief or excitement or just plain satisfaction at having made a decision that felt right, regardless of how it might turn out. "Then welcome to the Double R Ranch, Amy Sullivan. Let's see what we can figure out together." As if sensing that some sort of agreement had been reached, Rose stirred in her mother's arms and opened tiny dark eyes that seemed to take in the room with infant solemnity. She didn't cry, just looked around with the kind of alert attention that suggested she was already adapting to her new surroundings. From her carrier, Henrietta gave a soft cluck that sounded almost like approval, though Marcus suspected that might be wishful thinking on his part. Time would tell whether this improbable arrangement would work out for any of them, but for the first time in months, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow instead of just enduring it. Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack with a sound that spoke of wild places and endless possibilities. Inside the Double R Ranch, a cowboy, a woman, a baby, and a chicken that wouldn't lay eggs were about to embark on an experiment in practical problem-solving that would test everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. The next morning arrived with the kind of heat that promised another scorching day ahead. Marcus woke before dawn, as was his habit, and lay in bed for a few minutes listening to the sounds of his house. For the first time in years, those sounds included more than just the settling of old wood and the distant lowing of cattle. He could hear movement in the kitchen, soft footsteps, and the gentle clatter of dishes being arranged. When he emerged from his bedroom, he found Amy already up and moving, with the efficient grace of someone accustomed to early mornings and multiple responsibilities. Rose was propped in her carrier on the kitchen table, awake but content, watching the play of morning light through the window with fascination. The smell of coffee filled the air, rich and welcoming. "You didn't have to get up so early," Marcus said, though privately he was impressed by her initiative. Amy turned from the stove where she was tending to what looked like scrambled eggs. "Rose was up at 5, and when she's awake, there's no point in both of us lying in bed. I hope you don't mind that I made breakfast. I found eggs in your refrigerator and some bread that looked fresh enough." Marcus accepted the cup of coffee she offered, noting that it was exactly the right strength and temperature. "I don't mind at all. It's been a long time since anyone cooked in this kitchen besides me." They ate breakfast in companionable silence, both of them still adjusting to the reality of shared space and morning routines. Rose gurgled contentedly in her carrier, occasionally reaching toward the sunlight streaming through the window. From the spare room came the sound of Henrietta moving around in her carrier, probably wondering when she was going to be released from her traveling prison. "I should let her out," Amy said, following his gaze toward the hallway. "She's been cooped up for too long." "There's a fenced run behind the main chicken coop," Marcus offered. "She can have her own space until she decides whether she wants to socialize with the other birds." They walked outside together, Amy carrying Henrietta's carrier while Marcus held Rose. The morning air was still relatively cool, though the sun was already beginning to assert its authority over the landscape. Marcus's own chickens were scratching around their run, a motley collection of breeds that had proven themselves reliable layers despite the challenging conditions. When Amy opened Henrietta's carrier, the hen emerged with the dignity of a queen who had been temporarily inconvenienced but was now prepared to reclaim her rightful domain. She looked around the unfamiliar surroundings with alert interest, then began the systematic exploration that chickens conducted whenever they encountered new territory. "She's beautiful," Marcus said, watching as Henrietta discovered a patch of dirt that met her standards for dust bathing. "Your grandmother had good taste in chickens." Amy smiled, the expression transforming her face from merely pretty to genuinely lovely. "Grandma always said that Henrietta was special, that she had more personality than most people. She used to follow Grandma around the yard like a dog, and she could open simple latches with her beak." As if to demonstrate her intelligence, Henrietta had already figured out the mechanism of the water dispenser and was taking delicate sips while keeping one eye on the strange humans observing her. She showed no interest in the feed that Marcus scattered nearby, which might explain part of her laying problem. "What have you been feeding her?" Marcus asked. "The same commercial feed I've always used." Grandma swore by the brand, said it was what kept all her chickens healthy and productive. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes the simplest problems have the most complex solutions, and sometimes the reverse was true. "We'll try some different options, see what appeals to her. But first, let's get her settled and comfortable." Stress is the biggest enemy of egg production. They spent the next hour setting up Henrietta's temporary quarters, making sure she had adequate shade, fresh water, and a variety of food options to choose from. Amy worked with the easy competence of someone who had spent plenty of time caring for chickens, and Marcus found himself appreciating her practical approach to problem-solving. Rose, meanwhile, seemed perfectly content to be carried around the ranch, her dark eyes taking in everything with the intense focus that babies brought to new experiences. She didn't cry once during the entire morning, which Marcus chose to interpret as a good sign for their arrangement. By mid-morning, the temperature was climbing toward uncomfortable, and they retreated to the house to escape the worst of the heat. Amy settled Rose for a nap, then joined Marcus in the kitchen where he was reviewing the ranch's account books, trying to figure out how to stretch his dwindling resources until the next cattle sale. "Is it that bad?" Amy asked, noting the expression on his face as he studied the columns of numbers. Marcus looked up from the ledger, surprised by her directness. "It's been better," he admitted. 3 years of drought will test any operation, and I've had to make some hard choices about what to keep and what to let go." Amy moved closer to look at the books, and Marcus found himself noticing details about her that he'd missed the day before. The way she unconsciously tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when she was concentrating. The small scar on her left hand that suggested some old injury. The careful way she held herself as if braced for disappointment. "I used to do the books for my husband's business," she said quietly. "Before Rose was born, before everything fell apart. I might be able to help if you'd like." There was something in her tone that suggested her husband's business had been part of whatever had driven her to load up her truck and drive across the country with nothing but a baby and a chicken. Marcus didn't pry, but he filed the information away with everything else he was learning about his mysterious houseguest. "I'd appreciate that," he said. "Fresh eyes on the numbers might catch something I've missed." They spent the next hour going through the ranch's finances, Amy asking thoughtful questions and offering suggestions that showed she understood both the practical realities of agricultural economics and the emotional investment that kept people farming even when the numbers didn't add up. "You're not as bad off as you think," she said finally, leaning back in her chair with a small smile. "You're cash poor right now, but your assets are solid. The land alone is worth more than your debt. And if the drought breaks, you could rebuild the herd pretty quickly." Marcus felt a flicker of hope that he'd been suppressing for months. That's a big if. They're predicting another dry year. Maybe, but weather patterns change and you've got good water rights. That's going to be worth more than gold in the coming years. Her confidence was infectious, and Marcus found himself looking at his situation with something approaching optimism for the first time in months. Maybe Amy Sullivan was exactly what the Double R Ranch needed, even if he couldn't have predicted the form that help would take. From the spare room came the sound of Rose waking up, a soft gurgling that quickly escalated into more demanding vocalizations. Amy rose immediately. the automatic response of a mother who had learned to read her child's signals. "I should feed her," she said. "And then maybe we can check on Henrietta, see if she's showing any interest in the nesting boxes." Marcus nodded, though privately he doubted that one morning would be enough to solve Henrietta's laying problem. Chickens were creatures of habit, and whatever had disrupted this particular bird's routine would probably take time and patience to overcome. But as he watched Amy disappear down the hallway to tend to her daughter, Marcus realized that time and patience were two things he suddenly had in abundance. For the first time in years, he was looking forward to the challenges that lay ahead, rather than simply enduring them. Whether that was because of Amy herself, or Rose's presence, or even Henrietta's mysterious refusal to lay eggs, he couldn't say. But something had shifted in the atmosphere of the Double R Ranch, and Marcus was curious to see where it would lead. The second week at the Double R Ranch brought with it a rhythm that surprised them both with its naturalness. Amy had settled into the routine of ranch life with an ease that spoke of adaptability born from necessity, while Marcus found himself adjusting his long-established patterns to accommodate the presence of others in ways he hadn't expected to enjoy. Rose had indeed begun sleeping for longer stretches during the night, though her definition of sleeping through remained different from what most adults would consider adequate rest. She would wake twice, sometimes 3 times, requiring feeding or changing or simply the comfort of her mother's presence. Amy moved through these nighttime duties with practiced efficiency, but Marcus could see the toll it was taking in the shadows under her eyes and the careful way she moved when she thought no one was watching. Henrietta, meanwhile, remained stubbornly unproductive despite Marcus's best efforts to create an environment conducive to laying. He had tried different feeds, various nesting box configurations, and even relocated her to different areas of the property in case a change of scenery might inspire her maternal instincts. The hen seemed healthy and content, spending her days exploring the ranch with the curiosity of a natural historian, but she showed no inclination whatsoever toward producing eggs. On this particular morning, Marcus found Amy in the kitchen before dawn, standing at the window with Rose pressed against her shoulder, both of them silhouetted against the pre-dawn darkness. The baby was fussing with the kind of tired irritability that suggested another difficult night, and Amy was swaying gently in the universal maternal motion that sometimes worked and sometimes didn't. "Rough night?" Marcus asked quietly, not wanting to startle them. Amy turned, offering him a weary smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "She's been restless for the past few days. I think she might be starting to teeth, though she seems young for it. Everything I read says 4 months is early. But every baby is different." Marcus poured himself coffee from the pot Amy had already prepared, noting that despite her exhaustion, she had continued the morning routine they had established. "My sister went through that with her youngest, said it lasted for weeks and nearly drove her to distraction." "You have a sister?" The question was casual, but Marcus caught the undertone of genuine interest. They had been living in the same house for 2 weeks, sharing meals and daily responsibilities, yet they had revealed surprisingly little about their respective histories. Amy's past remained largely mysterious, shared only in careful fragments that raised more questions than they answered. 2 sisters, actually. Both married with families of their own. Lisa lives in Colorado with her husband and 3 kids. Sarah's in Oregon, works as a veterinary technician. Marcus settled into his usual chair at the kitchen table, watching as Amy continued her gentle swaying motion. "Haven't seen either of them in over a year. We exchange Christmas cards and the occasional phone call, but ranch life doesn't leave much time for family visits." Amy moved closer to the table, still holding Rose, who had finally begun to settle into a more peaceful state. "Do they know about your situation here? The financial difficulties?" Marcus shook his head, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever he thought about how far his circumstances had fallen from what his family expected. "They both married well, live comfortable lives in town. I don't think they'd understand what it's like to watch something that's been in your family for generations slowly slip away. You'd be surprised what people can understand when you give them the chance." There was something in Amy's tone that suggested personal experience with the weight of unexpressed burdens. Marcus found himself studying her profile as she looked down at Rose, noting the way the early morning light caught the auburn highlights in her hair and the gentle strength in her hands as she supported her daughter. "What about you?" he asked. "Family who might be wondering where you are." Amy's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a careful guardedness settling over her features. "My parents died in a car accident when I was 22. That's when I went to live with my grandmother, helped her with the chickens and the small farm she kept. Grandma was all the family I had until Rose came along." It was more personal information than she had shared before, but Marcus sensed there were still significant gaps in the story. The absence of any mention of Rose's father, for instance, or the circumstances that had led to their cross-country journey. He didn't press, respecting the boundaries she had established, but he filed the information away with everything else he was learning about this enigmatic woman. Rose had finally fallen asleep against her mother's shoulder, her tiny face relaxed in the peaceful expression that made all the sleepless nights worthwhile. Amy carefully shifted her position, preparing to carry the baby back to their room, when a sound from outside caught their attention. It was Henrietta, clucking with an urgency that was different from her usual conversational tones. Marcus recognized it immediately as the sound chickens made when they were distressed or excited about something, and he rose quickly from the table. "Something's wrong," he said, already moving toward the door. Amy followed, Rose still sleeping in her arms, and they stepped out onto the porch together. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, painting the landscape in shades of gray and gold that made the high desert country look almost ethereal. But their attention was focused on the chicken run, where Henrietta was pacing back and forth along the fence line with obvious agitation. Marcus approached the enclosure carefully, knowing that stressed chickens could be unpredictable. Henrietta immediately turned toward him, her head cocked at the alert angle that chickens adopted when they had something important to communicate. She clucked once, sharply, then deliberately walked to the corner of the run where Marcus had placed several different styles of nesting boxes. "What's she doing?" Amy asked, moving closer while being careful not to jostle Rose. Marcus watched as Henrietta inspected each nesting box with the thoroughness of a quality control inspector, occasionally letting out small sounds of apparent dissatisfaction. She would peer into a box, cluck disapprovingly, then move on to the next one. It was behavior he had observed before in chickens who were preparing to lay but couldn't find conditions that met their particular standards. "I think she's trying to tell us something about the nesting situation," Marcus said slowly. "She's been doing this for the past few days, but I haven't been able to figure out what she wants." Amy moved closer to the fence, studying Henrietta's behavior with the focused attention of someone who had spent considerable time learning to read chicken body language. Grandma always said that Henrietta was particular about her laying conditions. She had a favorite spot in the old barn, a wooden crate that Grandma had lined with specific materials. What kind of materials? Straw, mostly, but also dried lavender and mint from Grandma's herb garden. She claimed it made the eggs taste better, though I think it was more about Henrietta's preferences than any culinary benefit. Marcus considered this information, wondering if the solution to Henrietta's laying problem might be simpler than he had assumed. Chickens were creatures of habit and comfort, and if this particular bird had specific requirements for her nesting environment, meeting those requirements might be the key to restoring her productivity. "We could try recreating something similar," he suggested. "I've got plenty of straw, and there might be some wild mint growing near the creek." Amy's face brightened with the first genuine expression of hope he had seen from her in days. "Do you really think it might work?" "Worth a try. Chickens have their own logic, and if we can figure out what Henrietta's logic is telling her she needs, we might be able to solve at least half of our bargain." They spent the morning creating what they hoped would be Henrietta's ideal nesting environment. Marcus found an old wooden crate in the barn that was similar in size and shape to what Amy described from her grandmother's farm. Amy gathered wild mint and a few other aromatic plants from the areas near the ranch's water sources, while Rose napped peacefully in her carrier under the shade of the porch. The process of preparing the nesting box became an exercise in collaboration that revealed new dimensions of both their personalities. Amy approached the task with the methodical precision of someone who understood that details mattered, while Marcus contributed practical knowledge about chicken behavior and ranch resources. They worked well together, Marcus realized, their different strengths complementing each other in ways that made even mundane tasks more enjoyable. When they finally presented Henrietta with her customized accommodations, the hen approached the new nesting box with the cautious interest of a discriminating customer inspecting potential real estate. She circled it several times, clucked thoughtfully, then climbed inside to test the comfort and configuration of their work. "What do you think?" Amy asked, watching Henrietta's inspection with obvious anxiety. Henrietta settled into the nesting box, arranging the bedding materials to her satisfaction with the methodical precision that chickens brought to nest preparation. She remained there for several minutes, long enough for Marcus to begin entertaining cautious optimism, then suddenly stood up and walked away without ceremony. "Well," Marcus said, trying to keep disappointment out of his voice. At least, she didn't reject it immediately. Amy's shoulders sagged slightly, but she managed a rueful smile. Grandma always said that Henrietta would make her own decisions in her own time. Maybe we just need to be patient. Patience, Marcus had learned over his years of ranch life, was both the most essential and the most difficult virtue required for working with animals. Every creature, from cattle to chickens, operated according to internal schedules and motivations that didn't always align with human expectations or needs. But, in this case, patience was complicated by the terms of their agreement and the knowledge that Amy's future security depended on solving problems that might ultimately be beyond anyone's direct control. The afternoon brought new challenges in the form of an unexpected visitor. Marcus was working on repairs to the north pasture fence when he heard the sound of an engine approaching the ranch. Visitors were still rare enough to be noteworthy, and the timing suggested this wasn't a casual social call. The vehicle that pulled into the yard was a newer pickup truck, clean and well-maintained in a way that marked its owner as someone from town, rather than a working rancher. Marcus recognized it immediately as belonging to Tom Harrison, the loan officer from First National Bank who had been handling the ranch's financial arrangements for the past several years. Marcus felt his stomach tighten as he walked back toward the house, wondering what had prompted this unscheduled visit. His loan payments were current, though barely, and he hadn't requested any modifications to his existing agreements. That usually meant the bank had concerns they wanted to discuss in person, which was never a good sign. Tom Harrison emerged from his truck wearing the kind of carefully neutral expression that bank officials cultivated when delivering news that borrowers didn't want to hear. He was a decent man, Marcus knew, someone who understood the challenges facing agricultural operations, but he also had responsibilities to his institution that sometimes conflicted with his personal sympathies. "Marcus," Tom said, extending a hand in greeting. "Hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." "Tom, what brings you out here?" Before Tom could answer, Amy appeared on the porch with Rose in her arms, drawn by the sound of voices. Marcus saw Tom's eyes widen slightly as he took in the sight of the young woman and baby, clearly not having expected to encounter additional residents at the ranch. "I'm Amy Sullivan," she said, stepping forward with the kind of confident politeness that suggested she was accustomed to handling social situations. "I'm helping Marcus with the ranch operations." Tom's expression shifted as he processed this information, and Marcus could practically see him wondering about the nature of the arrangement and what it might mean for the bank's interests. "Tom Harrison, First National Bank." "Pleased to meet you, Miss Sullivan." "Mrs. Sullivan," Amy corrected gently, though she offered no additional clarification about her marital status or circumstances. "Perhaps we should go inside," Marcus suggested, recognizing the need for privacy in whatever conversation was about to unfold. "Amy, would you mind giving us a few minutes?" Amy nodded and disappeared into the house with Rose, leaving the two men alone on the porch. Tom waited until she was out of earshot before speaking, his expression becoming serious. "Marcus, I'll be straight with you. The bank's board of directors has been reviewing all our agricultural loans, looking at performance and risk factors in light of the ongoing drought conditions. Your account came up for discussion." Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that accompanied financial stress, but he kept his expression neutral. "My payments are current." "They are, and we appreciate that. But the board is concerned about sustainability. Your operation has been scaled back significantly over the past 3 years, and the projections for recovery aren't encouraging given current weather patterns and market conditions." "What exactly are you saying, Tom?" Tom shifted uncomfortably, clearly not enjoying his role as messenger. "The board wants to see a more detailed business plan for the ranch's future viability, something that demonstrates how you intend to rebuild the operation and improve cash flow. They're particularly interested in any new revenue streams or operational improvements you might be considering." Marcus looked out over his land, at the pastures that had supported his family for 3 generations, at the buildings his grandfather had constructed with his own hands. The idea of having to justify the ranch's existence to a group of bankers who had never worked a day under the Nevada sun filled him with a combination of anger and despair. "How long do I have to put together this business plan?" 60 days. I'm sorry, Marcus. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear, but the bank has to protect its interests. If you can show them a viable path forward, I think they'll be willing to work with you. After Tom left, Marcus sat alone on the porch for a long time, staring at the landscape that represented everything he valued most in the world. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in the brilliant colors that made the high desert beautiful despite its harshness. But for the first time in his adult life, Marcus found himself wondering if beauty was enough to justify the struggle required to maintain his connection to this place. Amy eventually emerged from the house, moving quietly to settle into the chair beside his. Rose was sleeping peacefully in her arms, and for several minutes they sat in comfortable silence, watching the day fade into evening. "Bad news?" Amy asked finally. Marcus nodded, then found himself telling her about the bank's demands and the 60-day deadline for producing a business plan that would convince skeptical financial minds that the Double R Ranch had a viable future. Amy listened without interruption, her expression growing more thoughtful as he spoke. 60 days, she repeated when he finished. That's not very long to completely restructure an operation. That's assuming there's a way to restructure it that makes sense. 3 years of drought don't disappear because you write a business plan about them. Amy was quiet for several minutes, and Marcus could sense her mind working on the problem with the same focused attention she had brought to analyzing his books. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of cautious excitement. What if we approached this differently? Instead of trying to rebuild the cattle operation to its previous size, what if we diversified? Created multiple revenue streams that could support the ranch even during difficult years? Marcus looked at her with surprise. What kind of revenue streams? Well, you've got 1,500 acres of beautiful land. People from Las Vegas and California pay good money for authentic ranch experiences. Agritourism is becoming a significant industry, especially in areas where people can escape city life and experience something real. The idea was so unexpected that Marcus needed a moment to process it. You're talking about turning the ranch into some kind of tourist destination? Not exactly tourist destination, more like educational experiences. People want to learn about ranch life, about sustainable agriculture, about connecting with the land. You could offer weekend workshops, day visits, maybe even longer stays for people who want to really understand what ranching involves. Marcus found himself considering the possibility, despite his initial skepticism. I don't know anything about the tourism business. But I do, Amy said quietly. Before Rose was born, before everything fell apart, I worked for a company that specialized in agricultural tourism. I helped develop programs for farms and ranches across 3 states. I know what works and what doesn't, what people are looking for, and what they're willing to pay for. This was the most specific information Amy had shared about her previous life, and Marcus realized it explained some of the confidence she had shown in analyzing his financial situation. But it also raised new questions about what had brought her to his doorstep and why she was willing to share her expertise with a stranger. Why didn't you mention this before? Amy's expression became guarded again, the careful mask she wore when discussing her past. Because that life is over. The company I worked for belonged to my husband, and when our marriage ended, I lost everything associated with it. But the knowledge is still there, and maybe it can help both of us. Marcus studied her face in the fading light, noting the pain that flickered across her features when she mentioned her husband. Whatever had happened in her previous life had left wounds that were still healing, but she was offering to use her professional experience to help solve his problems. It was a gesture of trust and collaboration that touched him more deeply than he had expected. What would something like that involve? Amy shifted Rose to a more comfortable position, her movements gentle despite the obvious exhaustion that seemed to be her constant companion these days. We'd start small, maybe with day programs focused on specific aspects of ranch life, chicken keeping, for instance. People are fascinated by the idea of raising their own chickens, but most of them have no practical knowledge about what's involved. As if summoned by the mention of her species, Henrietta appeared around the corner of the house, moving with the purposeful stride that chickens adopted when they had business to attend to. She clucked once in their direction, then continued toward her enclosure with the dignity of someone who had important matters to consider. Speaking of chickens, Marcus said, our friend there is still being uncooperative about the laying situation. Amy smiled, the expression lighting up her face despite her tiredness. Give her time. Grandma always said that Henrietta would produce when she was ready, not before. And we've only just started trying to recreate the conditions she's familiar with. What if she never lays again? What if this is just something we have to accept? Amy looked at him with surprise. Are you giving up on our agreement? Marcus realized that somewhere during their conversation about business plans and agritourism, his perspective on their arrangement had shifted. What had started as an impulsive offer to help a stranded stranger had evolved into something more complex, a partnership that he was reluctant to see end, regardless of whether Henrietta ever produced another egg. No, he said finally. I'm not giving up. But I'm starting to think that maybe the value of having you and Rose here goes beyond the terms of our original deal. Amy's expression softened, and for a moment Marcus thought he saw something that might have been hope or affection in her green eyes. But before either of them could explore the implications of that statement, Rose woke up and began the evening routine of feeding and fussing that would occupy the next several hours. As Amy carried her daughter inside, Marcus remained on the porch, thinking about business plans and agritourism, and the way his life had become infinitely more complicated and interesting since a broken-down truck had delivered his unexpected houseguests. The stars were beginning to appear in the clear desert sky, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the soft sounds of his cattle settling in for the night. For the first time since Tom Harrison's visit, Marcus felt something that might have been cautious optimism about the future. Whether that optimism was justified remained to be seen, but it was a welcome change from the resignation that had been his constant companion for the past 3 years. Inside the house, he could hear Amy's voice as she talked to Rose, the gentle murmur of a mother settling her child for the night. The sound filled the empty spaces of his home with warmth and life, reminding him that some problems were worth solving not because they were easy, but because the solutions might lead to something better than what had existed before. The next morning brought with it a discovery that changed everything. Marcus woke early, as was his habit, and stepped outside to check on the animals before beginning his daily routine. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold that made the high desert landscape look almost magical. As he approached Henrietta's enclosure, he noticed that the hen was already awake and active, moving around her space with more purpose than he had observed in recent weeks. But it wasn't until he got closer that he saw what had captured her attention. There, nestled in the customized nesting box that he and Amy had prepared the day before, was a single brown egg. Marcus stared at it for several seconds, hardly daring to believe what he was seeing. After weeks of disappointment and frustrated attempts to solve Henrietta's laying problem, the solution had apparently presented itself overnight, with no fanfare or advance warning. He was still standing there, grinning foolishly at the sight of one ordinary chicken egg, when Amy emerged from the house with Rose in her arms. She took one look at his expression and immediately understood what had happened. "She laid?" Amy asked. Her voice filled with excitement and disbelief. "She laid," Marcus confirmed, stepping aside so Amy could see the evidence for herself. Amy approached the nesting box with the reverence of someone viewing a minor miracle. Henrietta, meanwhile, strutted around her enclosure with the satisfied air of a job well done, clucking occasionally as if accepting congratulations for her achievement. "I can't believe it," Amy said, her eyes bright with tears of relief and joy. "After all this time, all the worry about whether she'd ever lay again." Marcus carefully retrieved the egg from the nesting box, holding it up to catch the morning light. It was perfect, with the deep brown shell that Amy had described, and the solid weight that indicated a healthy, well-formed egg. "One down," he said, offering the egg to Amy with a slight smile. "Now we just need to work on getting Rose to sleep through the night consistently." Amy accepted the egg with hands that trembled slightly, cradling it as if it were made of precious metal rather than calcium carbonate. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for believing this was possible, for helping me create the right environment for her. I know it probably seems silly to get so emotional about a chicken egg, but this represents so much more than just breakfast." Marcus understood exactly what she meant. The egg represented hope realized, problems solved through patience and collaboration. the possibility that other challenges might also yield to determination and creative thinking. It was a small victory, but in the context of their current circumstances, small victories felt monumentally significant. As they walked back toward the house together, Rose gurgling contentedly in her mother's arms, and the precious egg carefully protected in Amy's free hand, Marcus found himself thinking about business plans and 60-day deadlines and the future of the Double R Ranch. For the first time in months, that future seemed to hold possibilities beyond mere survival. Whether those possibilities would be enough to satisfy the bank's requirements remained to be seen, but the morning had already proven that unexpected solutions could emerge from patient effort and collaborative problem-solving. If they could get a stubborn chicken to lay eggs, Marcus reasoned, maybe they could figure out how to save a ranch as well. 3 weeks later, Marcus stood in his kitchen watching Amy prepare breakfast while Rose sat contentedly in her high chair, babbling at the morning sunlight streaming through the window. The transformation in their daily routine had been gradual but profound. Rose now slept through most nights with only occasional wake-ups, and Henrietta had become a reliable producer of one perfect brown egg each morning. The business plan Amy had helped him draft lay spread across the kitchen table, pages filled with detailed projections for diversifying the ranch into educational agritourism. Her expertise had transformed his rough ideas into a comprehensive proposal that even skeptical bankers might find compelling. The Double R Ranch Learning Center would offer weekend workshops on sustainable ranching, chicken-keeping seminars, and authentic ranch experiences for urban families seeking connection to agricultural life. Amy moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, scrambling fresh eggs from Henrietta while Rose gurgled happily in her chair. The domestic scene felt natural now, as if they had been living this way for years rather than weeks. Marcus found himself wondering what would happen when their original agreement officially ended, when Amy no longer had any obligation to stay. The sound of vehicles approaching interrupted his thoughts. Through the window, he could see Tom Harrison's truck followed by a sedan he didn't recognize. His stomach tightened instinctively, though he reminded himself that he had fulfilled the bank's requirements ahead of schedule. "The bank folks?" Amy asked, noting his expression. Marcus nodded, straightening his shoulders as he prepared to defend his ranch's future. Tom said he'd bring someone from the board to review the proposal in person. Amy wiped her hands on a dish towel, then moved to stand beside him in a gesture of solidarity that meant more than she probably realized. "You've got a solid plan, Marcus. The numbers work, and you have the expertise to make it succeed." The confidence in her voice steadied him as he walked outside to greet his visitors. Tom Harrison emerged from his truck, along with an older woman in a business suit, who moved with the authority of someone accustomed to making important decisions. "Marcus, I'd like you to meet Janet Morrison, president of our board of directors," Tom said. She wanted to see the property personally before making any recommendations. Janet Morrison had steel-gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing as she surveyed the ranch buildings and surrounding landscape. "Mr. Reed, I've read your proposal with considerable interest. The concept is sound, but I have questions about implementation." "I'd be happy to answer them," Marcus replied, gesturing toward the house. "Perhaps we could discuss it inside." As they settled around the kitchen table, Amy quietly served coffee while Rose entertained herself with a collection of colorful blocks. Marcus noticed how naturally Amy participated in the conversation, offering details about market research and operational logistics with the confidence of someone who genuinely understood the agritourism industry. "Mrs. Sullivan has extensive experience in this field," Marcus explained when Janet questioned a particularly optimistic revenue projection. "She's been instrumental in developing the entire program." Janet's eyebrows rose slightly. "I see. And Mrs. Sullivan, you plan to remain involved in this venture?" Amy glanced at Marcus, something unspoken passing between them. "Yes," she said firmly. "This ranch has become home for my daughter and me. We're committed to seeing this project succeed." The certainty in her voice surprised Marcus almost as much as it seemed to impress Janet Morrison. They had never explicitly discussed Amy's long-term plans, though he had hoped she would choose to stay beyond their original agreement. After 2 hours of detailed discussion and property inspection, Janet Morrison stood to leave with an expression that revealed nothing about her conclusions. "You'll have our decision within the week, Mr. Reed. I must say, your proposal demonstrates more innovation than we typically see from agricultural operations in this region." Tom lingered after Janet's departure, his expression cautiously optimistic. "I think she was impressed, Marcus. The fact that you have someone with Mrs. Sullivan's credentials involved definitely strengthened your position." After they left, Marcus and Amy found themselves alone in the suddenly quiet kitchen. Rose had fallen asleep in her high chair, her tiny fist still clutching one of her blocks. The weight of what had just transpired hung between them, along with the realization that Amy had publicly committed to staying at the ranch. "You didn't have to do that," Marcus said finally. "Tie yourself to this place when you don't know how things will turn out." Amy moved to lift Rose from her chair, cradling the sleeping child against her shoulder. "I meant what I said. This has become home for us. The first real home Rose has ever known, and the first place I've felt safe and valued in longer than I care to remember." The vulnerability in her admission made Marcus's chest tighten with emotions he had been trying to ignore for weeks. "Amy, I need you to know that regardless of what the bank decides, you and Rose have a place here as long as you want it. Our original agreement was just the beginning of something bigger." Amy's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Are you sure? I come with complications, Marcus. A past that might catch up with us, responsibilities that aren't yours to shoulder." "Everyone has a past," Marcus replied, moving closer to her. "What matters is what we choose to build from here forward. And I can't imagine building anything without you and Rose being part of it." Before Amy could respond, a commotion from outside drew their attention. Through the window, they could see Henrietta strutting around her enclosure with obvious agitation, clucking with an urgency that suggested something significant was happening. They hurried outside to investigate, finding the hen pacing excitedly around her nesting box. Inside the box, alongside her usual morning egg, was something unprecedented. A second egg, smaller than the first, but perfectly formed. "2 eggs," Amy breathed, staring at the unexpected bounty. "She's never laid twice in one day before." Marcus grinned, struck by the symbolism of Henrietta's timing. Maybe she's celebrating, figured out that her future here is secure, so she's going above and beyond her usual duties. Amy laughed, the sound bright and joyful in the morning air. Or maybe she's just happy. Really, truly happy for the first time in months. As Marcus carefully collected both eggs, he realized that happiness was exactly what he was feeling too. Not the careful contentment he had learned to accept during his years of solitude, but genuine joy at the prospect of sharing his life with these 2 remarkable females who had appeared on his doorstep like an answer to prayers he hadn't known he was offering. The bank's approval came 3 days later, along with authorization for a construction loan to build the visitor facilities outlined in their business plan. Janet Morrison's accompanying letter praised their innovative approach and expressed confidence in their ability to create a successful educational program. That evening, Marcus and Amy sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the Nevada sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. Rose played contentedly on a blanket at their feet while Henrietta scratched nearby, having graduated to free-range privileges after proving her reliability as an egg producer. "So we really did it," Amy said, wonder evident in her voice, "solved both problems and saved the ranch." Marcus nodded, though his attention was focused more on the woman beside him than on their business success. "Amy, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have said weeks ago." She turned to face him, her green eyes reflecting the last light of day. "What is it?" "I love you," he said simply. "I love you and Rose and the life we've built together here. I know our arrangement started as a practical solution to immediate problems, but somewhere along the way it became the most important thing in my world." Amy's smile was radiant as she reached for his hand. "I love you too, Marcus. I have for weeks, but I was afraid to hope that this could be permanent. Afraid that my past might ruin what we were building." "Your past brought you to me," Marcus replied, lifting her hand to press a kiss to her palm. "Whatever happened before, I'm grateful for the journey that led you here." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they made plans for their future together. A wedding in the fall, after the first tourist season ended. Legal adoption papers for Rose, giving her the security of Marcus's name and protection. Expansion of their educational programs to include year-round offerings for schools and youth groups. Henrietta, meanwhile, had discovered that her two-egg performance had earned her extra treats and attention, so she began making it a regular occurrence. Her productivity became legendary among local chicken enthusiasts, turning her into something of a celebrity in the agricultural community. Rose thrived in the ranch environment, her laughter echoing through the house as she learned to walk between the kitchen table and Marcus's waiting arms. Her sleep schedule stabilized completely, allowing her parents the rest they needed to tackle the challenges of running both a cattle operation and a growing agritourism business. The first official workshop weekend brought 12 families to the ranch, eager to learn about sustainable agriculture and authentic ranch life. Amy's professional expertise shone as she guided visitors through hands-on experiences with chickens, vegetable gardening, and basic animal husbandry. Marcus discovered he had a natural talent for storytelling, sharing ranch history and practical wisdom that captivated both children and adults. By the end of their first season, the RR Ranch Learning Center had exceeded all financial projections and earned recognition from the State Tourism Board as an outstanding educational destination. More importantly, it had provided Marcus and Amy with the foundation for a sustainable future that honored the ranch's agricultural heritage while embracing innovation. On a crisp October morning, exactly 6 months after Amy's truck had broken down in his driveway, Marcus stood in the same spot where he had first seen her emerge with Rose and Henrietta. The broken truck was long gone, replaced by a reliable vehicle suitable for their family's needs. But the chicken carrier that had held Henrietta during that desperate journey now served as a planter for Amy's kitchen herbs, a reminder of how far they had all traveled. Amy appeared beside him, Rose toddling between them on unsteady legs, both hands outstretched for balance. Henrietta followed at a dignified distance, having appointed herself as the child's unofficial guardian and entertainment director. "Any regrets?" Amy asked, slipping her arm through his as they watched their daughter explore the world with fearless curiosity. Marcus considered the question seriously, thinking about the solitary life he had led before their arrival, the financial struggles that had seemed insurmountable, the empty rooms that had echoed with loneliness rather than laughter. "Only one," he said finally. "I wish that old truck of yours had broken down here sooner." Amy laughed, the sound carrying across the ranch yard where their dreams had taken root and flourished beyond anything either of them had dared to imagine. In the distance, the Nevada mountains stood eternal and unchanging, but the RR Ranch had been transformed by love, determination, and the remarkable power of two people willing to solve problems together. Henrietta clucked her approval and went back to her important work of supervising Rose's adventures, secure in her role as the ranch's most productive and celebrated resident. She had never been just a chicken after all. She had been the catalyst that brought a family together and saved a way of life that had seemed destined for extinction. Sometimes the most important solutions came in the most unexpected packages, wrapped in feathers and delivered by fate to those brave enough to take chances on strangers with crying babies and hens that wouldn't lay. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.